There is much question and talk about the phrase mental illness, or saying, oh, so-and-so is mentally ill. I've often wondered in the past few years, what is the definition overall of mental illness? And furthermore, why some people whose lives otherwise are one-man wrecking shows or wrecking balls are typically the last people on the planet to be called, quote, mentally ill. And you might argue, in part because they often are the last people to seek, quote, professional assistance, or call it brick and mortar based assistance to help with their problems. And why might that even be, other than they're saying, well, I don't want to get a stigma if I seek, quote, help, and get labels, get diagnoses, and a pile of pills to take each day, and possibly it become public knowledge, or knowledge even to my employer. Now, there is one individual, a psychologist with a PhD, a name to be said at a future point in time perhaps, who specializes in the area she terms narcissism and secondarily sociopathy, terms that she uses. Well, she has brought up that her concept of mental illness, or rather what is discussed in America today and through the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is this: is there a subjective and strong subjective component of discomfort, you might say, or pain? Now, she may not have said these exact words, but this is the gist of it, I believe. And she contends it's rather confusing and problematic that those, she might say, who are, quote, narcissists or sociopaths, often do not have much subjective distress, and this then being a way in which they are typically not going to seek help, even if I would say it were not stigmatizing and not drug-inducing, so to speak, on a long-term basis. They simply are not in enough pain, you might say. And so, this being a device or filtering mechanism to decide who is, quote, mentally ill and who is not, who is in the most distress, to the point, say, of almost jumping off a bridge or trying to, in various ways, shapes, or forms, and hence even checking yourself in, say, to a facility for assistance, lest your life end rather abruptly, or so the feeling goes. And so, though, she brings out this oddity that you can be very impactfully negative upon others in terms of the phraseology she uses, say, narcissism or sociopath, and yet not be diagnosed with anything at all, and hence not be called, quote, mentally ill. In modern parlance, you might say those who are versions of Hitler or Stalin or Pol Pot would probably be the last people on earth to seek assistance, first of all, for stigma reasons, but also because they weren't in severe distress internally. And so they weren't compelled to address a severe pain point, if you will, as some marketers and salespeople talk of when deciding how best to sell products. Identify the pain point, they say. Well, if there is little pain point in many a, quote, sociopath or, quote, narcissist, then perhaps there is insufficient reason for them to go to treatment as one option and try to cover the field of all options possible in desperation, including psychiatric help from the brick-and-mortar institutions, shall we say, and in America, as per what is existing here. and the terminology then applied if you enter the doors of such training or such options. So I don't think I've ever heard anyone describe in an overall view what can be so distressing to make some people almost literally want to jump off a bridge in every way, shape, or form. Call it attempted suicide or completed suicide. What makes some want to do this, drives them to do this, and others, like a Hitler, never have that come across as even a thought, let alone an option to pursue, again, as an option, to ponder about. What is so distressing to us, and for some doesn't exist in a large-scale fashion? I have two thoughts, and I don't see these really discussed, but these are my overview thoughts. Some people, I would say, are what you call moribund. I don't know whether that term is in large-scale existence. I heard one actor, Hugh Grant, once use the term. But the term moribund, in my mind, meaning being saddled with so many particular weights upon oneself that one can barely function. Barely function cognitively, barely function motivationally, or both. In other words, some would call it vegetative thinking. I would say, as per the cognitive element, you're so slowed down. Your efficiency level perhaps at a 1, 2, or 3% level. I just throw that out as a figure to illustrate how low in efficiency some can be. This typically, as I've experienced it in my past, but not now, coming from several sources, say some terming it depression, or as one person told me their view of it, having been born in India, simply being bummed out. Or alternatively, what some would say, a lack of hope. Noticing that those who call a suicide hotline, or those who are suicide experts, they bill themselves as being perhaps, say the defining concept here is despair, hopelessness, and thinking things will never change and that resources might never come. Out of the blue, it seems, call it serendipity or whatever, to effect such a change too. Another factor, I think, and a big one for some, that can make one what I call so low on the level of efficiency that one almost grinds to a halt, is if one is subject to periods of guilt that are so crippling that one, again, functions on a very, very low level of efficiency. Some would call this a form then of ruminating about guilt. Now others would say, well, you can also ruminate about fears, or as I would call it also, catastrophizing issues. And to me then, this is yet another form of being moribund. The first being to be, quote, almost a vegetable, hence how the so-called depressed person finds themselves sleeping so often and so for so long as an escape mechanism from their thoughts. They're thus vegetative as far as efficiency level simply by way of the amount of time they can apply to solving problems, to learning anything about how to think better, and to address the problems in life that need to be worked through. And so, moribund in this sense. But guilt also very crippling. I experienced that a lot earlier in my life. And yes, fear to huge proportions sometimes can drive us to the point where we grind to a halt efficiency-wise. I think these two latter forms, guilt and fear, being factors that can make us so focused on what could happen, or what is so distressing thus to us that we simply can't function but on a vegetative level once again. And it occurs to me then, the commonality in all these forms of what you call being moribund are that there is a strong component of being almost what you call, with humor, a vegetable, functioning on a 1, 2, 3% level in terms of efficiency. Now, a fourth factor I would say is very distressing for some, and that's what they term in psychiatric circles here in America today, obsessive compulsiveness. Now, some would say simply being a perfectionist. Others would say even there being what you might call paranoia involved. Taking things too seriously, you might say. Turning some possible flaw from a molehill into a mountain. All of these, one form, way, shape, or form, I would say, of fear that something will, quote, go from something to hell in a handbasket. And so there being this element of being on edge lest a so-called disaster happen. And this utter concern, a form of fear, I guess. And I have to wonder if all fear, in fact, is part and parcel of this, by way of even Dr. Aaron Beck, with the cognitive fashion, saying, in his opinion, even espoused in a 7-minute video on YouTube, that major or almost all forms of psychiatric disorders are due to catastrophizing. Now, I would say at this point there is a distinction, I believe, and some others believe too, to make between what you call guilt and shame as performing a vegetative effect upon us. Brene Brown, for instance, has specialized in addressing shame issues, but I will leave it to each of us, of course, and myself to discuss the extent to which she has solved this problem or clarified it in general. But at any rate, shame, in my mind, being an element in which we fear that if someone doesn't like what we did, they will abandon us and we'll have to live alone in a room with our own thoughts, so to speak. Very distressing, as per philosophers talk of it, say by Camus, the philosopher in the 20th century. And so, guilt, on the other hand, being something by which we violate our internal principles of how we are to treat people and consider ourselves thus loving. If we violate this and then consider ourselves unloving, some would say selfish or what have you, then we feel what you call guilt. And problematically, many people, I believe, and some others too, have said it is possible to induce guilt to manipulate others. There being books on this, by the way, I could cite at a future point in time. Hence, some people you might call naive in the sense of being very guilt manipulatable and thus very subject to being moribund. Now, I would say, I believe, some people have defense mechanisms, if you will, that are quite different than all that I've mentioned, and so do not find themselves subject to this, what I call, facet of being moribund or very low on the efficiency level, functioning-wise. And then don't come up on the radar screen as, quote, mentally ill, because they're not suffering not only what some say is subjective distress, but distress to the point, then, that it is called impactful on your very cognitive and motivational functioning, what I call being moribund then. I hate to make an all or nothing distinction, but for many it ends up being that way. For what else would you call it if someone vegetates in bed, so to speak, way too much? or one is performing various escapist functions in general, because otherwise they would feel simply too much terror that makes them very, very inefficient in life. But then here I would call part two of what would make some people experience severe subjective elements of massive distress. And it is this: not necessarily anything I mentioned so far, but simply matters of survival to get your needs met. If you did something, say robbed a bank and ended up in prison, this would be quite distressing, to the point where you would not find yourself feeling very at ease very often. In a prison cell, typically, especially in certain countries. And so anything that subjects you to a prison sentence could be called very distressing and a grounds for being called mentally ill. Noting again that the so-called narcissist and the so-called sociopath typically are not in prison, and so are not subject to these or this particular massive distressor that most anyone would find very distressing, both in and after the fact, after release, if happening, with all the stigma and all, and other factors involved too, wear on one's health, including brain cell health. A second factor: can the person hold a job rather reliably and with an income sufficient, typically speaking, to support not only oneself but a family? Children involved too, typically. Hence, can one go beyond a level of having to live in a car, some would say, at least sleeping at night in it? Can one go beyond the level of living in the bush of Alaska in a cabin? Can one go beyond the level of living in a tent, some would call it, or what I would call euphemistically a modern-day teepee? Can one do all of this such that one can not only survive oneself and without stigmas, but in even an urban environment if one so desires, and many do desire, and with a family? For if one has a family, the family would probably be much less interested in these alternative forms of sleeping, shall we say, or housing at night than otherwise. Noting thus that soldiers would find it very hard if they brought their families along on the battlefield or in training. The spouse would not be too excited, I think, of that lifestyle. Just like most spouses would not want to go with you if you were in the National Geographic going up the Amazon in a motorboat. You might do it alone and sleep in the motorboat even at night, but not a spouse and children desiring optimally to do so themselves. It has happened, but very rarely. Thus, issues of alcohol overuse or other chemical-based drug overuse causing massive distress for most people if they can't hold a job or end up in prison or in the drunk tank, so to speak. I'm not sure what the parlance is, but at any rate, if they find themselves unable to hold a job and reliably and at an income level such that they can get housing that I've been talking of and a family structure which most desire for a variety of reasons, then this is very distressing for most everyone and comes up on the radar screen. The elements of causing it, forms of mental illness. Might I add then, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders has a category, what I would call for sociopathy, called antisocial personality disorder, by which one can lose jobs or end up in prison or be a pariah in their community for certain reasons, and hence experience prison time or loss of employment, and loss also of one's family as per a spouse fleeing or one's children being taken away, and perhaps one being imprisoned as a so-called deadbeat dad. Whereas if one does something that is impactful to others negatively, but it is typically not a matter of being arrested for, some might call it forms of white-collar criminality, or certain endemic ways of making money, very systematized, that you can get off scot-free for. Call it loopholes in the legal system, if you will. Well then, these individuals would not be subject to arrest or imprisonment very likely, very often, sometimes even venerated in their cultures or sub-societies, at certain points in time anyway, until further judgment is rendered in future generations even. They then, experiencing little distress of a subjective nature, I would say, concerning time in prison, or besmirchment even of one's reputation in a community setting. One might even get venerated for having a, quote, gotten away with murder and being clever enough to do so. I might finally add, and this is not totally complete perhaps, but has been something I've been writing about for my own purposes and thinking about for years now. There can be the issue of what we call being very distressful for others and delighting in it. Some would term this, especially in past circles in psychiatry, displacement. Psychoanalysts referred to it in previous writings as kicking the dog when getting home because one had a difficult day at work with the boss, or taking it out on the wife or the kids, it is said, or spouse. Some might term this alternatively as sadism, but in either way, shape, or form, it being rather debatable in a sense that many a person doing this can get away with it very easily, it being a very subjective thing to discuss. This even then codified into law sometimes as an option for people to engage in, especially in certain countries. Like America, there is corporal punishment upon children allowed, call it spanking, or if you will. It even being advocated in certain religious scriptures. Do not spoil the rod, or you will spoil the child. Or rather, do not spare the rod, or you will spoil the child. But the question being, is this corporal type punishment administered solely in a positive way, or does it have a displacement component to it, a sadistic component upon which the parent delights in seeing the child suffer? And hence, why even it was described to me once by a psychologist or social worker that some parents have played sports, rough sports with their children, delighting in seeing their children get injured, and call it simply rough play or having a good time in the backyard playing football or whatever. And so, if an individual engages in displacement of rage upon some target, and they get away with it because it is tough to prove motivation and who is, quote, sensitive to oversensitive versus who is not, well then, this can be then very not a factor in distress of an internal nature, and individuals thus not compelled to, quote, seek help from professional circles, they call it, and get stigmas, and including the term mental illness applied to them. And yet, it being very distressing to others, their way of life. Again, you might say Mr. Hitler, so to speak, was very distressing to many, and he enjoyed it. He didn't just have a desire to build a better nation, a superior being, so to speak, but I believe he enjoyed seeing other people suffer, whom he called his opponents. And it did not land him in jail, so to speak, or give him a bad reputation in the overall sense in his country. And so he did not, in these terms, find it distressing. So my overall contention is, what is termed distressing, what lands us either in a situation of being very moribund, or in prison, or our reputation besmirched or unemployable, and unable to raise a family, or even have a spouse, these we call very internally distressing, but not necessarily externally distressing, and so get called, in my opinion, mental illness. But the rub being, there can be many a person who can be very, very distressing to others, not only in the short term, but to our society, our culture, our very Earth's existence, or other life forms on it, as well as our own in general, and their impact not considered something we would call a form of mental illness, because it is not called distressful. It simply is, it is said. And there being often very much an element of blame shifting until way too late as to what caused what. Environmentally, degradation of animal species, or other factors too, even war, or the dreaded nuclear war. My overall conclusion, then, is that with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders having over 500 diagnoses now, I believe most every single one of these relates to matters of anxiety or matters of being moribund in general, but not addressing two words because they're not in the DSM. Sadism, as per being a person very impactfully negative upon others and enjoying it, used to be called displacement. Secondly, what you might call sadism, or rather sociopathy, having a negative impact upon others, but not oneself, not in the short run anyway. In fact, sometimes even getting medals for it, or being considered in general very clever. And clever having a survival advantage often to oneself in the short run especially. Call it expedient in the short run. To recap then very briefly, there is nothing saying you have a disorder if you harm others and you can get away with it. There being various ways of doing so, or blame shifting the effects too. Secondly, again, if you delight in others being harmed, and it is very difficult to pin motivations, of course, especially in a court of law. Where would you come up with a proof? And so these two terms not in the DSM, sadism and sociopathy. But if you injure someone and you injure yourself in the same way by ending up in prison or out of a job chronically, or unable to make money very well at all, comparatively speaking, if this renders you getting a bad reputation in the community also, as a so-called burglar of sorts, then I think this is very distressing, and it is called antisocial personality disorder, not sociopathy. Because sociopathy implies that you got away with it somehow, and maybe even have been venerated by some people. But antisocial personality disorder implies that you were impactfully negative to others or some, and you did not get away with it in terms of a prison sentence or impactfulness upon employment, money, etc., reputation too. These are my thoughts then on what we call mental illness or not. We don't have a term thus for whom we might consider the most dangerous or most negatively impactful people on the planet, especially in the long run. Maybe we should.